everybody, it's Courtney and I am here with another design team project for Scrapping for Less. Today I'm using this little mini stamp set by Heffy Doodle called Mewniverse. And this is a tiny stamp set. So we are going to make 3 very quick, clean and simple cards today. I started off by stamping my images with Lawn Fawn's jet black ink on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'll be doing some quick Copic coloring here, not worried about too much shading here, but I am starting off with my lightest color, as always, mapping out my darkest areas, adding in my darkest color, then my mid-tone, then my lightest color. For these little baskets, the highlight will be in the center, being it's a round object. I wasn't overly careful with my coloring. My first intention was to fussy cut these out right along the black line, and then I decided later on to leave a little white border. So after my coloring was done, I did have to go in with my colorless blender or gel pen if it was a darker area to clean up any areas where I was just a little bit too messy. For my little cats, I wanted to color them all gray. All of these will be colored the exact same way. So I'm using my warm gray markers. For my warm grays as well as my cool grays, I find that these blend a lot better than maybe any other colors. So I can go in with my darkest color here, which is a W5, and I'm just mapping out where my darkest areas and where my shadows will be. Then I'll go in with my mid-tone, which is a W3, and then fill the rest in with a W1. For their little noses, I use an R20 marker, and I could go just right over the W1. It's such a light color that I didn't really have to worry about the pink not showing up. Once all of my images were colored, I went ahead and put those aside to fussy cut out later. And we will move on to the panels for the rest of the cards. For the first panel, I'm using a piece of Canson watercolor paper, and I'll be using 2 colors of Distress Oxide. I'm using Picked Raspberry and Seedless Preserves. And we're doing a really messy watercolor look. So I'm just taking a paintbrush here and putting on some clean water right in the center of the panel, and I'll smush down my ink pads right on just an acrylic block, pick up some of that color and just drop it down in the center. I didn't realize how similar these colors were, but I'm okay with that. So I just laid down that color, let the water kind of blend them and spread them out a little bit, and then I'll just extend it. Extend the color just a little bit further, add a little dots here and there so it's not so controlled. Looks a little bit messy, and then I will put aside that panel to dry. My next panel, I'll be working on a piece of the Neenah Solar White cardstock, and this time I'm going to be using my Distress Oxides again. I have a mask here that will mask out a circle right in the center of my card panel. You can create one of these with just a circle die, or you can use a stencil, and I'm using Lucky Clover and Salty Ocean. My thought process here was to make it look like Earth because the sentiment is Mewniverse. So I just kind of laid out my colors here and blended them out as much as I possibly could. I laid down the green first and then blended that out with the Salty Ocean. Once these 2 colors were about as blended as I was going to get, when I removed the mask that I had created here, it had shifted a bit. But I was able to just take a sand eraser and kind of fix up that area where it had shifted. Next, for my third panel, which is probably the easiest of all three, I am using Distress Oxide ink in the color Shaded Lilac, and I'm just laying down color in the lower right hand corner. I start off dark and kind of just let that fade out. If I were to do this again, I probably would have used regular Distress ink, just because I can fade that out to white a little bit better than I can with Distress Oxides, but that's fine. It's just to add a little bit of interest where my image will be. And I ended up stamping my sentiment with the Distress Oxide inks, which you can't really do with the regular Distress inks. So once I had my color laid out, I did splatter a little bit of clean water and just blotted that up. I couldn't find a paper towel, so I used the edge of my shirt, which works just fine. So once my images were fussy cut out, I went ahead and adhered the little cat to the back of the basket to make him look like he's coming out of the basket. And then I used some foam tape to pop that up on each panel. I put it together the same way for each card. For this little universe one, he's going to go right in the center. And for the watercolor panel, wasn't quite dry, so I put that aside for a few more minutes. And for this little ink blended one in the lower right hand corner, I just adhered him to that same area. And for the watercolor panel, I adhered this little guy right to the center. Now for the sentiments, I will do something a little bit different for each one, but again, keeping it very clean and simple for all three. For the first one, I am going to white heat emboss the sentiment. Now the sentiment is 2 separate stamps, so I'm just doing them separately to help me line them up a little bit, and I will end up cutting these out in strips and adhering those onto my card panel. I'm just using white embossing powder here. You want to make sure that you do use an anti-static tool first, especially when you're working on black cardstock, because any stray embossing powder will show up and be very noticeable. So I took my same Scotch foam tape here and just adhered these 2 little strips onto my little universe card here, right below my little cat. For the next panel, I separated the sentiment, being it is 2 separate stamps. I stamped the, oh, I'm sorry, I went back to the watercolor. So I'm stamping the sentiment in the VersaFine ink. I'm putting part of the sentiment on top of the cat and the rest of the sentiment below the cat, both using the same ink. For the third card, I'm also separating the sentiment, though it'll be grouped together, but I'm going to be doing it in 2 separate colors. So for the longer part of the sentiment, the first part of the sentiment, I stamped that in the VersaFine, and then to bring in a little bit more of that Shaded Lilac, the Mewniverse, I am stamping with that Shaded Lilac. That's what's great about Distress Oxides, is you can easily stamp them and you get a really good impression. Next, I just added a few Nouveau drops and a little bit of shimmer to some of the areas just to bring in a little bit more interest. After all of these were dry, I did trim them down and add them onto colored card panels just to add a little bit more. But that is it for today. 3 very quick, clean and simple cards with 1 mini stamp set. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.